Okay, and we're live. Hare Krishna, dear devotees. Thank you very much for joining us this evening on the ISKCON of New Jersey Zoom channel. And we are very delighted and honored to have tonight His Grace Radhika Raman Prabhu. So, as you all know, we have had His Grace Radhika Raman Prabhu a couple of times on this forum, and his classes have been very well received and viewed many, many times over and over again on YouTube. He's one of the most sought after speakers in ISKCON. You may not know that Radhika Raman Prabhu never really went to school. He just went straight to being an academician. He was actually homeschooled by his parents in Boise, Idaho, him and his brother both, and then he went on to receive a bachelor's degree, two bachelor's degrees in mathematics and philosophy from Boise State University, and then moved on to get his PhD at Oxford University. He's one of the youngest graduates from Oxford University to have received a PhD, and then he's moved on to the area of academics, and he's actually a chair holder at a university in Utah in the Department of Religious Studies. But beyond that, he's also one of the members of the Shastric Advisory Committee of ISKCON, which is a body formed by the GBC, and he's also an instructor at in the various institutions of education, especially in Radhadesh. So, I mean, this list goes on and on, but he's a wonderful, dear friend of our devotees here, and especially me personally. We're honored to have him as our friend. And he's come to Towaco many times and given some wonderful seminars that have been very practical, enlightening, and very applicable in our lives as we try to improve ourselves spiritually and improve our practice. So, without much more ado, I'd like to hand it over to Radhika Raman Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Jai, thank you so much, Madan Gopal Prabhu, for that kind introduction. Just to remind myself, we have an hour total or an hour and a half?
About an hour, but we can go on over 10 minutes or so. That's fine.
Okay. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So the title for today's talk is Recognizing and Resisting the Effects of Impersonalism in Our World. And so I want to talk about impersonalism, but also in a little bit of a practical sense as to how we can experience or perceive it. I want to apologize, my voice is a little bit hoarse today, so I'll try to be clear, but if anything is unclear, then just ask me to repeat. Let me start by telling a story. There are often moments in one's life. There are some moments, especially early on, that have kind of a defining effect and that stick in our memories. And for me, one of those times was I was probably in, I don't know how old, maybe 12 years or 13 years old or something. I'm not quite sure. But in Boise, Idaho, where I grew up and where my parents ran, or the ISKCON Boise Temple, there was a particular group, an Indian group of swamis and teachers that came to Boise to do a program. And they were quite an impersonalist group, as we discovered when we went to their evening program, which occurred at a hall in Boise. And that evening, it was a very interesting experience because they were speaking very, very strong impersonal ideas, a very strong impersonalist philosophy of how, God has no form, and God, kind of the classical impersonalism in a very direct way. And we are one with God, and we're all one with each other. And then every so often, when the talk would become a little boring, they would stop and do kirtan, singing, Govinda Jai Jai, Gopal Jai Jai, or other nice kirtan. And I remember thinking, sitting in that audience, feeling really upset that if you don't accept Krishna as being transcendental and as being worshipable, then what right do you have to sing his names? Just to keep everyone, you're using a tool of the Vaishnavas to keep your audience awake. And And so anyway, that was we came home that evening, and the next day, the leader of the group came to the temple to visit, and I remember very distinctively that as he and his associates came into the temple room, everyone bowed their heads to the deities, Radha, Banki, Bihari, but he just couldn't. He didn't. He wouldn't. And I remember thinking again that last night he had just spoken that God was present everywhere and all beings were worthy of respect. And yet in the temple, it was very difficult for him to show that respect. So anyway, so then at that point, I was just, I was young and really excited, and this was my first experience of a real Mayavadi. And I had read about Mayavadi so much in Prabhupada's books, and this was my first experience of a real one, so to speak. And so I thought, we have to have a debate. I was itching for some kind of conversation. And when I didn't bring up the conversation, but we sat down, we offered them a little bit of prasad, and the conversation just kind of started moving in that direction. And one thing happened after another. We discussed one point after another until they finally quoted, he was quoting verses, I was quoting verses. And finally he quoted this verse, Prakrite kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashaha ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. So this gentleman, he said, see, what Krishna is saying here is that everything is actually done by Prakriti, by the laws of nature, and that we are not the doer. Only the fool thinks that I am the doer, I am the karta, kartaham iti manyate. And so therefore we have to understand that there is no karta, that there is no doer there. This idea of individualism is false. And at that point I said, hold on, Krishna said that there is no doer, na karta. So we are not the karta. What is the opposite of we are not the karta? Is that we are not the doer, which means we are the servant. We are not the master. We're not the controller. We are the observer, but not the doer, and the experiencer, but not the doer. How can you say that we do not exist, right? So I am the doer. The opposite of that would be I am not the doer. I am the doer. The opposite of that is not I do not exist, right? So I said, where's that logic coming from? I'm the doer. Krishna is denying that. Therefore, he's saying I don't exist. And there was one of those moments where it was kind of a gotcha moment where he visibly became disturbed and then just left that verse and moved on to other ones. But once I had noticed that I got him on that verse, I kept bringing him back to it again and again, Anyway, I was a little hot-blooded at that time and eager for a fight. So I must admit, I don't know how good I was or anything, but it was one of those experiences where I'll never forget. It's kind of burned in my memory. And I really enjoyed it, that whole experience, that opportunity. And I think Krishna gave it more for me than for him, because he went on his way and I don't think I made much of an impact. But for me, it was a very wonderful experience, very interesting one, and I learned a lot from that. In the years since, of course, things have changed quite a bit. I've learned a lot more about impersonalism and how it works. And as part of my academic work and as part of the service that I do, I have to examine a variety of different books and translations of the scriptures that are done by different scholars and academics and preachers and philosophers, devotees, intellectuals, and especially for the Bhagavad Gita, which I think everyone here knows there are so many editions of Bhagavad Gita out there. And every time a new edition comes out, people will say, what do you think about this translation of the Gita? Because not only does every major academic press has to have their own edition of Bhagavad Gita to be considered respectable, if they publish anything in the area of Indian philosophy. But also they have to make sure that there's always a new translation available for the market because people get tired of old translations. So anyhow, in this process of examining a variety of different translations, when my students ask about them or I have to look at them for various reasons, I've come to use kind of a litmus test for how to recognize the theological bent of a particular translation, how to seek out impersonalism within a translation. There's, of course, many places you could look, but my favorite location, my favorite place to look, because it always works. I found it to be a surefire litmus test to kind of test the waters and see what degree of impersonalism are we going to find here, or Vaishnavism, personalism are we going to find, is chapter 4 of Bhagavad Gita. And particularly the verses starting with Ajopi san navyayatma bhutanam ishvaropi san, going into yada yada hi dharmasya paritranaya sadhunam and janma karma chame divyam. So I want to begin by just showing you this verse and describing to you a little bit of what we watch out for here and what that actually means. So let me share my screen real quick. So here you have Bhagavad Gita chapter 4, text number 6. And I'll read the verse, the translation, and Srila Prabhupada's purport. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Ajopi san avyayatma bhutanam ishvaropi san prakritim swam adhisthaya sambhavam yatma mayaya. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Although I am unborn and my transcendental body never deteriorates, and although I am the Lord of all living entities, I still appear in every millennium in my original transcendental form. Purport. And you'll see in the purport, Prabhupada goes straight or very quickly into the question of impersonalism. The Lord has spoken about the peculiarity of his birth. Although he may appear like an ordinary person, he remembers everything of his many, many past births, whereas a common man cannot remember what he has done even a few hours before. If someone is asked what he did exactly at the same time one day earlier, it would be very difficult for a common man to answer immediately. He would surely have to dredge his memory to recall what he was doing exactly at the same time one day before. And yet, men often dare claim to be God or Krishna. One should not be misled by such meaningless claims. Then again, the Lord explains his prakriti or his form. Prakriti means nature as well as swarupa or one's own form. The Lord says that he appears in his own body. He does not change his body as the common living entity changes from one body to another. The conditioned soul may have one kind of body in the present birth, but he has a different body in the next birth. In the material world, the living entity has no fixed body, but transmigrates from one body to another. The Lord, however, does not do so. Whenever he appears, he does so in his same original body by his internal potency. In other words, Krishna appears in this material world in his original eternal form with two hands holding a flute. He appears exactly in his eternal body, uncontaminated by this material world. Although he appears in the same transcendental body and is the Lord of the universe, it still appears that he takes his birth like an ordinary living being. And although his body does not deteriorate like a material body, it still appears that Lord Krishna grows from childhood to boyhood and from boyhood to youth. But astonishingly enough, he never ages beyond youth. At the time of the Battle of Kurukshetra, he had many grandchildren at home, or in other words, he had sufficiently aged by material calculations. Still, he looked like a young man, 20 or 25 years old. We never see a picture of Krishna in old age because he never grows old like us, although he is the oldest person in the whole creation, past, present, and future. Neither his body nor his intelligence ever deteriorates. Therefore, it is clear that in spite of his being in the material world, he is the same unborn, eternal form of bliss and knowledge, changeless in his transcendental body and intelligence. And then I'll pause here, and I want to read just the verse and translation for the next one. Very, very famous verse. Krishna says, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyuthanam dharmasya tadatmanam srijamyaham. Whenever and wherever there is a decline in religious practice, O descendant of Bharata, and a predominant rise of irreligion, at that time I descend myself. And in Prabhupada's purport, just the first two sentences here. The word srijami is significant herein. Srijami cannot be used in the sense of creation because, according to the previous verse, there is no creation of the Lord's form or body, since all of his forms are eternally existent. Therefore, srijami means that the Lord manifests himself as he is. So there's a couple of things I want to point out in these verses. Okay, the reason they serve as such a great litmus test for impersonalism in any translation of the Gita is because of Krishna's words here, tadatmanam srijamyaham. So whenever there's a decline in dharma, Krishna says, at that time, tadatmanam srijami aham. At that time, I, now the question is, how do you translate this word srijami, which Prabhupada raises right away? The word surj in Sanskrit literally means to flow forth, okay? So srijami is often translated as creation, just like the word sarga in Sanskrit or visarga, which means creation, comes from the same verbal root surj. So create is a reasonable translation in some contexts, okay? The word atmanam can mean self, or it can mean body, or it can mean mind. Remember one place Prabhupada says that the word atma can mean body, mind, or soul. So from a dictionary perspective, one way to translate this phrase that Krishna has, the last sentence of that verse, is whenever there's a decline in religion or in dharma, at that time, I create a body for myself. Okay? Now, what does that mean? That means essentially that Krishna is a living being, a spirit soul like we are, who takes on a material body made of the 5 elements, a body that will age and grow and decay and eventually die. Because that translation is possible, and again, possible in a dictionary sense, this is why Srila Prabhupada immediately goes into that issue in the first sentence of that purport. He raises the question of how do you translate the verb srijami? And in the previous purport that we read, Prabhupada emphasizes the point that Krishna does not seem to age like we do, right? So there's a specific reason why Prabhupada is addressing that point in that verse, because the question of aging, if Krishna had a body, if he created a body for himself, as this verse might be translated, then that would mean his body was made of the 5 elements like ours is, which would mean it would age like we do. And Prabhupada is saying Krishna's body never ages, therefore that is not an appropriate translation. It's an incorrect translation. Of course, it's also incorrect because of the context. Later on, just a couple verses down, Krishna says, Janma karma chame divyam. My birth and my activities are divine. So they're not of the type of birth that you typically find in this world, a birth into a body produced by karma. So Krishna makes that clear. And yet, if someone is not careful in how they translate, it's very easy Even in the first verse, prakritim swam adhishtaya, he stands or employs his own prakriti, and prakriti can be translated again, not as his internal energy, but as material energy, right? So he assumes a form made of prakriti, of material energy. So it's very easy to translate it in this sense. And even those who are not impersonalists in a real hard-headed sort of way, like some people like that group I met in Boise, they were impersonalists in a very conscious sort of way, in a very direct way. But I would venture to say that the vast majority of thinkers in this world are actually not, or even just not just philosophers, but just general people in this world. The vast majority are not impersonalists in a conscious, systematic, hard-headed sort of way. They just kind of lapse into an impersonalism. In some ways, it's almost a default position in the material world. Because remember, after all, that's why we're here in this world, is because we like the position of being Krishna. We want to be like Krishna. And that's the foundational ground of impersonalism. So because we're all here for that reason, to play God, therefore impersonalism seems quite natural, even though it's very unnatural for the soul, but it feels natural because of our conditioning. And so most people just kind of lapse into an impersonalism that's not a very thoughtful impersonalism. And even those translators of the Gita who are not trying to be impersonalists or not trying to be followers of Shankara, if you read their translation on these verses, you can recognize that they unthinkingly end up taking on an impersonalist position of Krishna having a material body like us and taking birth in this world like we do. Now, of course, the problem with that position is that if Krishna has a body like we do, then as Srila Prabhupada points out numerous places, his words become not any greater significance than my words or your words or anyone's words. Because like you and me, he's just a conditioned living entity covered by Maya. Those who are impersonalists in a formal sense, Mayavadis, followers of Shankaracharya, attempt to salvage the situation, this problem, deal with it by stating that, well, Krishna is like us in that he has a material body, but he is a living entity who is already fully enlightened, unlike us. Or his body is conditioned only by the mode of pure goodness, by the material mode of goodness, rather than us, where we are conditioned by passion and ignorance as well. Krishna is only conditioned by ignorance. So he still has a material body, but it's kind of better. It's pure. He's more enlightened than we are. And in this way, they try to then say, okay, therefore Krishna's words are worth listening to. But the greater problem, of course, with that kind of view of Krishna is that it takes away any good reason to love him. If his body, his birth, his activities are nothing better than our birth and our activities and our bodies, then we have nothing really to love and appreciate about him, because his body is merely Maya. All his qualities are Maya. His beautiful form is Maya. His pastimes, his associates are all Maya. And we directly run into the problem of why would it be the case that the supreme ultimate Brahman would be covered by Maya? How would it be possible that that which is Sat, Chit, and Ananda, eternity full of knowledge, conscious awareness, and blissful, assumes or takes on or is covered by the forces of temporality, of ignorance, and of suffering? And this is, of course, the fundamental argument that Ramanujacharya very famously gives against impersonalism. This is one of the 7 arguments he gives, is that this Maya, how is it possible that Brahman could be covered at any point or in any degree by Maya, if in fact the absolute truth is Sat, Chit, and Ananda to an infinite degree? How is that infinite knowledge and bliss covered by something so materialistic and so painful and so ignorant? But I find one of the most powerful and beautiful arguments against impersonalism that Prabhupada gives. I find it to be in Canto 1, Chapter 9 of Srimad Bhagavatam, where Srila Prabhupada writes this beautiful purport. Okay, this is in the description of the passing away of Bhishma Dev. Bhishma Dev, this is at the end of the Battle of Kurukshetra. He's lying on his bed of arrows and in a state that would be painful for anyone else. And he's getting ready to leave his body any moment. And Krishna and the Pandavas come there, and he looks at Krishna's beautiful form, remembers his pastimes, and gets ready to leave his body. And as he's watching, he's observing Krishna, he's having his darshan, he's remembering his favorite moments of association with Krishna. Krishna in the form that he so loves. And this is Krishna as the chariot driver of Arjun, Parthasarathi, holding the reins of the horses in one hand and the whip in the other hand, and his face covered with the dust kicked up by the hooves of the horses, and his face beaded with sweat. And most amazingly, he's relishing the thought that it was his arrows that pierced Krishna's body and drew blood. And Krishna's body is decorated now with those drops of blood. Now, this is most amazing, most surprising, because of course, why would it be the case that a devotee has this vision of giving apparent pain to their Lord and then drawing blood and relishing that exchange? And Srila Prabhupada has this wonderful, wonderful purport there where he says, he puts this in italics actually. He says, in fact, let me just share this with you. He says, this is 1938, and he says, the dealings of Lord Krishna and Bhishma Dev on the battlefield of Kurukshetra are interesting because the activities of Lord Sri Krishna appeared to be partial to Arjun and at enmity with Bhishma Dev. But factually, all this was especially meant to show favor to Bhishma Dev, a great devotee of the Lord. And then he says, the astounding feature of such dealings is that a devotee can please the Lord by playing the part of an enemy. And then he goes further down to describe very, very sweetly. He says, right here. There was no need to come before Bhishma Dev with blood and wounds, but he did so because the warrior devotee wanted to see the transcendental beauty of the Lord, decorated with wounds created by a pure devotee. This is the way of exchanging transcendental rasa, or relations between the Lord and the servitor. By such dealings, both the Lord and the devotee become glorified in their respective positions. The Lord was so angry that Arjun checked him when he was moving towards Bhishma Dev, but in spite of Arjun's checking, he proceeded towards Bhishma Dev as a lover goes to a lover, without caring for hindrances. I mean, isn't that amazing, that sentence, right? That The Lord is angry. Arjun is trying to stop him. But the reason Arjun cannot stop Krishna from trying to kill Bhishma Dev is because Krishna is going to Bhishma Dev as a lover goes to a lover without caring for hindrances. Apparently, his determination was to kill Bhishma Dev, but factually it was to please him as a great devotee of the Lord. The Lord is undoubtedly the deliverer of all conditioned souls. And here comes the punchline. The impersonalists desire salvation from him, and he always awards them according to their aspiration. But here Bhishma Dev aspires to see the Lord in his personal feature. All pure devotees aspire for this. That final sentence to me is just like, it's so powerful. It's as powerful an argument as I've seen, even though there's, formally speaking, there's not a whole lot of argumentation there. Prabhupada is essentially just, in many ways, he's just pitying the impersonalist. He's shaking his head and saying, you know, they want to merge, they want to experience the Lord's effulgence, or they want to not be there with the Lord in that rasa. It's okay, Krishna will fulfill their desires. But as for us, we don't want any part of that impersonalism. We would much rather have this exchange of love, an exchange that prompts the Lord to love the devotee even more for shooting arrows into his body and drawing blood. That's the kind of rich, confusing relationship that we are interested in. That's complicated. That's difficult to predict. That's always full of excitement and ups and downs and full of waves of emotion, where nothing is predictable, nothing is stable, nothing is straightforward when we speak about the personal form of the Lord. The impersonal Brahman is completely straightforward. It's steady. It's always the same. And therefore, it's always peaceful and quiet and gentle and boring, right? That type of world for a Vaishnava is nice, but that's all it stays at, is nice, right? Whereas Sanatana Goswami says, actually, there is no bliss in knowledge of Brahman. He then says, well, this is in his commentary to Brihad Bhagavatamrita. He says, there's no bliss in Brahman. And then he says, well, maybe there's a little bit of bliss, just for kind of a little taste, a few drops, but not real bliss. And he says, well, someone might argue, Brahman is Satchid Ananda, right? It's the abode of bliss. So isn't it blissful to know Brahman? And he says, no. Brahman is bliss, but he cannot give bliss. And this is not his argument. This is the argument of Shankaracharya, that Brahman is bliss. He is not blissful. Brahman is awareness or knowledge. He is not full of knowledge, because as soon as you say blissful, now you've got a quality, right, with a person, because people are blissful. So he says, no, he's bliss, right? So therefore, Sanatana Goswami says, Brahman is like a mountain of sugar with no one to taste it, with no ability to taste itself. It's just there, right? It's just there. You can consciously know sugar, a mountain of sugar that must be sweet, but you're not allowed to taste it. Because for tasting, you need senses, you need personality, you need experience, and that's not allowed in impersonalism. So in this way, he says that bliss is not real. Right? It's there, it's real, it's real, but it's not a benefit to anyone. It's not experienceable, it's inaccessible, it's locked away. So this becomes eventually, by the 16th century, this becomes so tasteless, even to classical Mayavadis, 15th, 16th century, the bhakti movements in India are roaring. And of course, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he's the flood of love of God. And along with him, so many bhakti poets and saints are there, from Surdas to Mirabai to poets all north, south, east, west, all over India, Tukaram in Maharashtra. So by this point in history, by the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, even the impersonalists are finding that mountain of sugar to be very irresistible and finding it difficult to hold themselves back from tasting it, from experiencing Krishna's pleasure and joy. And I'll give you one little example of this. There's so many examples of this, how impersonalism becomes really mixed up with bhakti in very interesting ways, just because bhakti becomes so irresistible. But one very nice example of this is the great philosopher Madhusudana Saraswati. Madhusudana Saraswati wrote several books, very, very staunch Mayavadi, follower of Shankaracharya. But in his commentary to Bhagavad Gita, Gita Gudhartha Deepika, I think it's called, he has this wonderful verse in which he glorifies Krishna. And I'll just read it for you here. I don't have it to show you, but he says, it goes like this. Yeah, Bhagavad Gita Gudhartha Deepika. Dhyana bhyasana vashikritena manasa tannirgunam nishkriyam. Dhyana bhyasana vashikritena manasa tannirgunam nishkriyam. Jyoti kinchanam yogino yadi param pashyanti pashyantu te. Jyoti kinchana yogino yadi param pashyanti pashyantu te. Asmakam tu tadeva lochana chamatkaraya bhuyachiram. Asmakam tu tadeva lochana chamatkaraya bhuyachiram. Kalindi pulinodare kimapiyan nilam maho dhavate. Kalindi pulinodaro kimapiyan nilam maho dhavate. Now listen to the translation. Very, very sweet. And if the yogis, with their minds controlled by the practice of meditation, see that indescribable light without attributes, without actions, and supreme, let them see it. But as for me, may that wondrous blue effulgence, which runs about and plays on the banks of the Yamuna, be the joy of my eyes. So look at how much he struggles with the impersonal aspect, right? He's saying, if those who want to see that indescribably bright light, those yogis, pashyanti pashyantu te, those who see it, pashyanti pashyantu, let them see it, let them have it. As for us, asmakam tute, he says, asmakam, I much prefer that blue light that runs on the banks of the Yamuna. So not quite seeing Krishna yet, but at least we've got a bluish effulgence running around on the banks of the Yamuna, right? Which is what he prefers to meditate upon, right? So he's jabbing at the impersonalists, even though he himself is from that pedigree, right? He's jabbing and saying, not the white light, I like the blue light better. So anyway, in this way, that sweetness that Prabhupada is hanging forward in this purport, he's sort of dangling it in front of the impersonalists, saying, you see this sweet relationship that Bhishma Dev has with Krishna? You can't have it if you're going to be an impersonalist. We've got it, right? This sweet relationship becomes irresistible, starting the 15th and 16th centuries, to just about everyone. And even the impersonalists at that point start writing commentaries on Bhagavatam, doing many things. Now, so with Krishna, once we have Krishna as having a form made of the material elements, right? Which was the problem, remember, with that verse that we talked about, Srijamyaham, when it's not translated properly. You've got Krishna who has a body made of material elements. and therefore Krishna loses his individuality and his specialness and uniqueness. This no doubt then leads very quickly to us living entities as individuals losing our individuality and losing our uniqueness, right? It's just a very short step from one to the other, of the supreme being non-individual and non-personal, impersonal, to the living entities, that is us, being non-individual and impersonal. Very quick step. It doesn't take long to get one from one to the other. And once you move from the divine being impersonal to the human being impersonal, the individual living entity, now we've got full-blown impersonalism. Okay, now it's out of hand. So far in those verses, it was kind of implicit. It could be accidental almost, as we discussed. But from that, the problem with that is that there's kind of a slippery slope leading then to, well, if Krishna is impersonal and he's liberated, then we, of course, also are impersonal. And then we get impersonalism becoming the default mode of understanding existence for all living beings. And when that happens, then we find impersonalism percolating, finding its way through all aspects of our existence, our human existence. And this is, I think, one of the most virulent aspects of impersonalism in our world today. Sometimes it can be very easy to think of impersonalism as that exotic philosophy out there taught by Shankaracharya and described by such intellectual elites like Madhusudana Saraswati way back 500 years ago. It can be easy to put it aside. And I remember in the book Hare Krishna Explosion, Hayagriva Prabhu writes about how in the early days when Prabhupada was lecturing in 26 Second Avenue, he would speak about the impersonalists, the Mayavadis, and the devotees, they would listen to this and think, wow, Prabhupada must have like a real personal grudge against some group in India that we're not familiar with. I wonder why he keeps going on about it. And then he says at some point we realized that Prabhupada was talking about us. He wasn't talking about a group in India that he had a fight with. He was talking about the dominant mode of thinking in the world. And so if we look carefully in our world around us, we come to recognize that impersonalism is actually not some disease way out there for philosophers to have. Impersonalism is something that is present all around us in so many different ways. And we see it grow and flourish in many, many different ways, and grow and flourish in greater ways as Kali Yuga progresses. So if we look at some very common things around us, we can see how things advance in impersonalistic ways. For example, something very simple, straightforward. Consider all the ways in which automation has changed our world. How everything is automated. You can, of course, if you call most companies, you will not speak to a human being, but you will speak to a machine who sounds very much and responds very much like a human being. Instead of purchasing your goods at your local store where you know the shopkeeper and you know their family and you know what goods are coming and what's in season or not, we've got large companies like Amazon where we can click one thing and we never have to know who's selling us that item. We don't have to know who's packing it. We don't have to know who's shipping it to us or delivering it. And we have it in our doorstep in a couple of days or less. If you go to the average fast food store, which I hope you don't, but in case you do, then there's 100% automation, right? Where every burger is going to taste exactly the same. Who's making it makes no difference. Who's selling it to you makes no difference. Who's handing it over and packaging it and putting it through the drive-through window, it makes no difference. Every time you drive through that, it's going to be exactly the same item, tasting exactly the same way, right? And now with the increase in shopping services, for example, we can order what we want. We don't have to know who sold it to us, who's shopping for us. It's just delivered in our doorstep. And you notice that the one thing that is common in each of these different forms of automated technology is that the person is cut out. There is no person in the middle. And when there is no person, that is by definition impersonalism, right? The person is gone. Think of all the ways in which we're turning towards smart technologies. I recently read an article in Time magazine which described the home of the future. And this was an article describing it in glowing, joyful terms as just like heaven. One day heaven will descend to earth and we'll have smart homes. This is a home where there will be temperature sensors built into your bathroom sink handles, so that when you open the sink in the morning, it can take your temperature and tell you if you're sporting a fever. And it's going to have a fridge that will let you know when you're at the store that milk is almost run out. And it's a house that will immediately suggest for you a particular medicine if it feels that you've got a temperature, and order that medicine from Amazon and have it delivered within the day for you. Now, all of this was being described as beautiful and glorious, but imagine the assumptions behind it. The assumptions behind each one of these is that there is no person at home who would be touching your hand or your face and saying, "Oh, you feel warm today. Are you okay?" There's no one at home you can call from the store to ask them, "Are we out of milk? Do we need more?" There's no one who can go run to the pharmacy and get us a medicine if we need it. The assumption with all of this is that there is no person around. Or even if there is a person, we don't need that person, right? So again, once again, this is the definition of what we might call impersonalism. So, automation, artificial intelligence, and then the last thing I want to point out is in nature, in the natural world, right? We have started to think of the natural world as resources. How many times have you heard the phrase natural resources? What is a resource but an object to be used and exploited, right? Definitely not people, although we do speak sadly about human resources as well. The reality is that if we look at every traditional culture of the world, and very much so the Vaishnav culture, we find that nature was seen in very personal ways. And this is a big topic that we don't have time to go into. But everything from plants to animals, to weather patterns, to the sun and the moon, to rivers, everything is personal. Rivers are goddesses, mountains are personalities, trees are persons. To this day, actually, in many parts of the world. In India, you can still go to a village and find a tree that is regarded as a person, right? That personal relationship with nature is gradually being supplanted by an understanding of nature as merely the composition of impersonal forces that run and work with no individuality involved in them. The one tiny little place where we still speak of aspects of nature as personal is with hurricanes. When a hurricane shows up, we give it a name and we say, Katrina comes with great fury. And as she roars past, Texas or whatever, so we speak of it in personal terms. But we've in general lost the ability to see nature in personal ways. And we see it merely as impersonal forces. In this way, I would suggest that we be very vigilant to recognize the subtle creep of impersonalism and sometimes not so subtle creep of impersonalism in our world today, all around us, in so many ways where we don't recognize, and we even might consider to be wonderful and praiseworthy. And so lastly, I want to conclude by offering a few thoughts on how we can resist that impersonalism in our environment, right, in our world. I think the very first thing we have to say, following in the footsteps of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he says that the most important way to resist impersonalism is to always keep in the association of Vaishnavas, of those who are devotees of Krishna, who love everything personal in the world. And that helps us always remember that the personalism is first and foremost. Okay, so association. The second thing I think we can do is in every decision that we make, every service that we have, every policy that we uphold, we always ask ourselves first, where is the person in this decision? So often we can make decisions in regard to systems, in regard to principles, in regard to ideals, in regard to what's practical, in regard to what's resourceful or financially feasible. And we forget that the very first consideration, for a devotee at least, is the person. In any kind of decision, in any kind of service, the first thing we should ask is, first, who am I? Right? What is my nature? Why am I doing this? Where am I at as a person, as a devotee? Secondly, who are we as a sangha, as a group of people? What kind of association am I in? And once we have understood the people involved, then we can ask ourselves, what is the process? How do we do what we want to do? And only then should we raise the question of resources. Because otherwise the resources can really dictate the whole discussion from start to finish, right? When in reality, it's the person that we need right from the beginning. The third thing I want to mention, I'm going through these very quickly, but I'm happy to discuss any of these in more detail in the discussion, in the question and answers. But the third I want to mention is limiting our time on social media and engaging. Studies after studies have shown that when we hide behind a screen, somehow people are far more comfortable saying things and doing things that they would never say or do to anyone's face. Before we criticize someone, especially online, why not try to meet them and see who they are as a person? And we realize all of a sudden that they're usually not as two-dimensional as we make them out to be. But somehow, because the medium of the internet is so impersonal, it allows us to feel scot-free. And there's a psychological term for this, and I'm forgetting what it is. But it allows us to just let ourselves loose and behave in ways that are basically impersonal in nature, because the person we're criticizing, well, is not a person. It's just a name, it's a figure, it's an avatar, it's a screen idea, and that's it. This is true, by the way, all the way from school age to adults. Everyone does it. Because it allows you a certain degree of anonymity, or shall we say, impersonality online. And the last thing I want to say, and hopefully end on this positive note, is to say that I think one of the most wonderful features of personalism, of being a devotee, is that a Vaishnava always focuses on the details, on the particularities. You see, impersonalism is all about generalities. Okay? Impersonalism is all about generalities. That effulgent light, which is the same everywhere, which is ever present, which is omniscient, which is omnipotent, which is in all beings. You and I are the same. It's all about generalities, about unities. Personalism, on the other hand, is all about particularities. And this is why when you find that the devotees, the Vaishnavas, are glorifying Krishna, how do they glorify him? By describing him in wonderfully detailed, particular ways. Krishna has the kadamba flower in his left ear, right? Is it the right ear or the left ear? No, it's the left ear. And he's holding the reins in his right hand and the whip in his left, or is it the other way? But these things are specified. He's remembering the beads of sweat, Bhishmadev. He's remembering the beads of sweat on Krishna's face. The drops of blood. He's remembering exactly which hand he had the reins in and which hand he had the rope in. He's remembering what shape Krishna's earrings are, right? We find that whenever Vaishnavas glorify Krishna, it's all about the particularities. It's all about being specific, being detailed. When the four Kumaras go to Vaikuntha, they start off as, not as Mayavadis, but as impersonalists, Brahmavadis, all about the general impersonal absolute. But when they go to Vaikuntha, what changes their heart to become personal devotees of the Lord? It's the fragrance from the Tulsi Manjaris mixed with the fragrance of Krishna's lotus feet entering their nostrils. Now, that is specific. It's a very specific little thing that changes their life. And in the same way, Kavi Karnapura describes that Sarvabhaum Bhattacharya, the great Mayavadi that Mahaprabhu changed, his defining moment after the discussion, but the one that really drew him in, was when he received Jagannath Mahaprasad from the hands of Mahaprabhu himself. And he tasted that Mahaprasad and his impersonalism was over. So this is the life of a devotee. If we want to be personalists, we have to look in Krishna. What is it specifically about Krishna that I love? Not just that he's God. That doesn't do it. What is it particularly about Krishna? Very specifically. And when you say something, you say, oh, it's Krishna's beauty. Well, what about his beauty? The fact that he's a little boy. Well, what about being a little boy do you like about him? Well, he's very mischievous. Well, in what way is he mischievous? And keep going further and further and further into the particularity. Keep asking yourself that question. Well, what is it about that? Until you get to something so specific that you know it could belong to no one but Krishna. Only he could have that specific quality. And then you know you're talking about the personal deity, the personal Godhead, not the impersonal absolute. So I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for your attention. And if we have a few minutes, maybe some questions and discussion.
Hare Krishna. Thank you. Yes, I think we can spare a few more minutes. The devotees are very eager to ask some questions. We have some questions and comments in the chat box, as well as devotees want to ask personally. I wanted to just make a comment about this idea of this Brahmananda, the joy of being liberated in this impersonal light. And I've heard it described as relief. You know, that we have so much pain in the world with our poor interactions and our bad relationships that we just want relief from it all. And you get it, but then how long can relief last? Relief is not bliss; it's just relief. You know, how long can that last? You know, so that was a good way of seeing it. And then after the relief has come and gone, you're reveling in relief for a few seconds or moments, and after that, it's actually hellish if there's no interactions. Which is why. The Kaivalyam Narakayate Tridasha Puraka, that this Kaivalya liberation is actually hell. You know.
Yeah. That's a very wonderful point, Madan Gopal Prabhu. In fact, it reminds me of something I forgot to mention from Sanatan Goswami. In that same place in Brihad Bhagavatamrita commentary, he says the bliss of Brahman, when he says it's just a little bit, he says it's the bliss, like the bliss of a deep, dreamless sleep.
Mm.
He says, like a sleep without dreams. Oh, those sleeps are nice. I mean, when you've had them, it's really good, right? You wake up feeling really refreshed. But the point is, you have to wake up and move to activity. That's what allows you, it's the very process of waking up that allows you to relish the dreamless sleep, isn't it? In the sleep itself, you're not consciously relishing it at all. It's when you wake up that you go, oh, that was a nice night. I got a good night's sleep. So his point is, it's that kind of sleep. No one wants to be in a deep, dreamless sleep forever. That's rest in peace. That's death. Right?
Right.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Question from Ishwadullah Prabhu. How do we avoid being impersonal in our dealings with Vaishnavas? It seems to me that if we think impersonalism may be okay when dealing with so-called non-devotees, that will inevitably bleed over into our dealings with devotees.
Yeah. Could you say the last sentence has got cut off? If we're
Yeah. It seems to me that if we think impersonalism is okay when dealing with so-called non-devotees, that will inevitably bleed over into our dealings with devotees.
Oh, I agree. I agree. That I think it's very important that we don't try to live two lives where we're impersonal in one sphere and then try to be personal in another, because it won't work. Our impersonalism will seep into our dealings with devotees as well. There is no question about that. And the reason for that is because of our conditioned state. Like I was saying, impersonalism is unfortunately kind of the default in the material world. It's convenient, it's lazy to slip into an impersonalism. And it's so much easier not to get to know the person you're dealing with and just deal with them on a purely mechanical level. But here's the thing, if we practice personalism, even in our so-called secular lives, at work or wherever we are, we'll find that people love it. They think there's something really amazingly spiritual about you. When it's spiritual, but it's also just being personal. Every living entity is craving to be recognized as a person. And even that person you're sitting next to on the subway or in the airplane, which is not a very common experience these days, but when it was, sitting next to that person, and when you get to know that person in some way, or even just for a minute or two, it's the whole environment, the whole relationship completely changes, right? So it's very crucial, I think, this point that we have to practice personalism consistently throughout our life. And if we do that, there's no loss. We'll only be more successful materially, honestly speaking, not to mention our success spiritually.
Thank you, Prabhu. We have His Holiness Jayadvaita Swami Maharaj with us, and he'd like to make a comment. Maharaj.
Yeah. Thank you. About that question, it seems to me that we're dealing with two different definitions of impersonalism. I find this coming up fairly often. Impersonalism in a psychological sense or a sociological sense has to deal with a sort of callousness, a sort of disregard of the feelings of others and that sort of thing. To my understanding, that's just not what Prabhupada's talking about. It really has nothing to do with what he's talking about. He's not talking about how we deal with people, whether we're empathic or callous. He's talking about the concept that the absolute truth is not a person. I just don't think I don't see a real relationship between the two topics. You could make one, but I don't think that's really what the subject at hand is. I wonder what you think about that.
Yes, Maharaj, please accept my obeisances, and thank you for that valuable comment. I agree that Prabhupada is not speaking of the of relational personalism in the purports that I read particularly, or most often he's speaking about the philosophical impersonalism of Mayavad philosophy that is well known to come from Shankaracharya and then become diluted in various forms throughout the ages. So that connection is a connection that I'm drawing particularly. And to go a little bit deeper into it, that connection, in my experience, the structures of society that we set up that are impersonal in nature that I was speaking of earlier, this movement towards impersonal forms of technology, impersonal attitudes towards nature. These, although in individual people's dealings may not seem to be philosophically driven, in fact, these structures of impersonalism are born from an underlying philosophical outlook of impersonal outlook that is created and nourished in the works of thoughtful, though mistaken, people, scholars and academics and authors who consciously cultivate a certain approach, a certain love affair with things like Buddhism and things like secular humanism that have impersonalism as an undergirding philosophical idea. And they're developed and well cultivated there, and then they seep into then common forms of practice as those thoughtful intellectual people then teach students, create innovations and inventions, produce technologies, and then the vast majority of people, like sheep, end up just going along with it and read that Time article and go, oh, that would be so cool to have a house like that. And then they end up becoming impersonalists in sort of a default way. So I 100% agree that it's Prabhupada is not drawing that connection. My intent was to make that connection, though, in the class from whatever academic reading I've done. And so yeah, thank you. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's really a connection, but I suppose we can draw one, and I wouldn't object.
Sure. Thank you much.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one or two more. So Gaur Kumar Prabhu asked this on the chat. It says, attention to details is a sign of love. That's what you explained earlier. So what inspires and motivates the impersonalists, as there's no love or reciprocation? And why are there so many impersonalists in India currently? So what is their motivation to be impersonalists if there's no real love?
Yeah, so the motivation for impersonalism is not actually difficult to come across because, as Madan Gopal Prabhu said earlier, there's first the desire for simply relief, right? My material, and Prabhupada makes this point about how my material life is so miserable, my relationships are so miserable, so it's just so much easier or straightforward to think, if I get rid of relationships, period, if I get rid of individuality, period, then I will be peaceful. And I guess you do become peaceful, but then where is the joy in that peace? So some of it is just simply the natural reaction, I think, of someone who's being burned in fire to run away from it, right? And say, I want nothing to do with it, with that experience. And others are more consciously or in a vitriolic way, they're impersonalist, where the motivation is, I want to be the enjoyer, essentially. I mean, that's the underlying motivation for all of us in the material world is we want Krishna's position as Bhoktaram Yagyatapasam, the enjoyer of this world. And when we want that position, because it seems like such a great place to be the enjoyer, to be the master, then we're drawn towards impersonalism because it gives us that. I mean, if we look at Buddhist ideas, there's a real attraction there to be free, to be independent, not to have any dogma, not to be told what to do. Of course, this is a certain version of Buddhism. Not all versions are like this. But there's, in that sort of very heady form of Buddhism that is prevalent in intellectual circles today, it gives one the ability to be the master of your own life and the master of your own intelligence and your own fate. And that's a huge attraction for impersonalism.
Thank you, Prabhu. We have a question from Vijay Krishna Prabhu. Vijay Krishna Prabhu, please go ahead. We're kind of running out of time, so if you can keep your questions tight, that'll be appreciated.
Yes, Prabhu. Radhika Ramandas Prabhu, can you hear me?
Yes, Prabhu, please go ahead.
Yes, Prabhu, the living entity is part and parcel of Lord Krishna. But let us put aside being part and parcel. And let's go for the living entity is an eternal servant. And my idea is that if the living entity is an eternal servant, but simultaneously it is part and parcel, that means that somehow Krishna is also a servant, and let's call him the supreme servant. So after presenting this train of thought, I need to ask you, my question is, what is there in Krishna as the supreme servant that help us become better servants, more personalistic, in order to fight against maybe our worst enemy, impersonalism?
Yes, so your point about Krishna as a supreme servant is a very nice one. In fact, that form of Krishna as the supreme personality of servitor Godhead, Prabhupada has a wonderful phrase, describes Lord Balaram or Lord Nityananda, where Krishna demonstrates what it means to be the supreme servant. Because if he's the supreme everything, then no doubt, not only is he the supreme master, but he's also the supreme servant. And when Krishna decides to serve his devotees particularly, no one can best him at that activity. So he's the supreme personality of servitor Godhead. And in that way, then, his representative is the spiritual master, the guru. And so this is the point. It's that guru is the ideal spiritual master who then teaches us how to serve Krishna in this personal way, right? Who draws us away from the impersonalism and brings us to the shelter of Krishna's lotus feet. So very nice point.
Thank you very much, Prabhu. Wonderful session. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Well, thank you very much. I think we are quite a bit over time, so unfortunately we won't be able to get to everyone's questions. We do have a couple of announcements to make, after which we will open it up for everyone to thank Radhika Ramana Prabhu. I'm going to also request His Grace Nilamani Prabhu to offer a few words of thanks, but I'm just going to, let me see. So on Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock, we have these Pathways to Perfection series, which is a very beautiful series of talks. If I could find it here, share it. Let me try it again. So this is from the Bhakti Center, Pathways to Perfection. My share screen doesn't seem to be working. And let me try it again. Here we go. Yes. So this continues next Saturday on October 17th with Gauranga Prabhu. Radhika Ramana Prabhu spoke earlier on September 19th in the same part of this series, and we have some wonderful speakers upcoming as well. So please join for that. 9 a.m. Eastern Time to 10:30 on the Bhakti Center channel. It's tinyurl.com, Bhakti Center. And then on our channel, on this ISKCON of New Jersey Zoom channel, on Saturday morning, on that same morning at 11:30, we have His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami Maharaj reading from his poetry book called Soul Eyes. So please make note of that. It's a separate session, but it's on the same channel that we are on right now. And as so you all know, the password is 108, but just make note of that if anybody else wants to know as well. So on this channel, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we have His Holiness Jayadvaita Swami Maharaj speaking on the second canto, and it's a very interactive, dynamic session, so please join for that, 8 p.m. On Tuesday, we have a special speaker, Vrindavan Vinodini Devidasi. And then on Thursday, we have Dayananda Prabhu. Dayananda Prabhu is a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. And then on, of course, mentioned Satsvarup Maharaj. And on Sunday evening, which is just about 1 week from today, we have Shesha Prabhu. So as always, we have an excellent lineup of speakers. So please make it a note to join us on this channel. It's a real blessing to be able to offer such wonderful programs, and it just makes the whole it just adds another level of ecstasy in our existence when we can do this in spite of all these difficulties in the world. So now I'll be inviting everybody to unmute themselves, but I'd like to request Nilamani Prabhu to lead us in thanking Radhika Ramana Prabhu and thanking all the devotees. Go ahead, Nilamani Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Radhika Ramana Prabhu, and with pranams. So, one thing that really touched me from your class discussion, your earlier story about your argument with that impersonalist philosopher who came to Boise, it was reminding me of Jiva Goswami's little disagreement with Rupa Goswami. So I'm wondering if your father banished you from the house for a few years, and then someone had to find you in somewhere in some corner. But I can't imagine anyone who would want to argue on scriptural basis with you. So I just, obviously he didn't know anything about you. So
Thank you, Prabhuji. Thank you. It was a fun experience for me. I can't remember clearly what happened to them. But yeah, I learned a lot.
You obviously followed in Jiva Goswami's footsteps afterwards and did your thesis on his work and everything. So
this is me trying to find my way in the world and trying to figure out, get like the first punches that a child throws. I was just practicing like that. Anyway, thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you for a wonderful class. Thank you.
Such a young child in our movement can defeat so heavily a whole group of impersonalists. Imagine what the grown-ups can do, and that'll probably shake them up, freak them out. Prabhupada said we kick them on the nose with boots, these impersonalists. Of course, I'm sure you didn't quite get there, but thank you so much, Radhika Prabhu. We always look forward to hearing from you. And please, dear devotee, if you'd like to unmute yourselves and just say a quick word of thanks. So we have about a minute or so. Hare Krishna. Haribol.
Hare Krishna. Thank
Hare
you so
Krishna.
much, Radhika
Oh.
Raman. So awesome.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Oh, good.
Jai.
Hare Krishna, Dandavad.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Radhika Raman Prabhu. Thank you. Hare
Wonderful
Krishna.
class. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Haribo, Radhika Raman.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Sorry, my obeisances.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Oh, nice.
Hi, Haribol.
Radhika.
Thank you for your well thought out presentation.
It was very
Thank you.
personal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika Raman Prabhu. Wonderful.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.
Prabhu ki jai. Samved ki jai.
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 Hari Hari Bol.
Hare
Hari Hari Bol.